Thank you for inviting me today. My name's Katie Morass, and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of Bath. And I'm going to be talking today about interviewing autistic witnesses. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about how autism might impact upon a person's ability to provide evidence in a neurotypical interview environment. And then I'm going to talk about how current police interviewing methods are appropriate or not for autistic witnesses, what alternative techniques could be used, and some other considerations and remaining challenges. So first of all, let's think about how autism might impact upon a person's ability to provide evidence. Well, police interviews are basically formal social interactions which present numerous challenges for autistic people unless modifications are made for a more enabling environment. So these include language and communication. So obviously that's the kind of currency of a police interview. Often there can be misunderstanding around things like having a very literal interpretation of questions to things like, I'm going to jog your memory, or draw your own conclusions, or questions that are posed as statements. Also in autism, we quite often see receptive language issues. So that's difficulties in understanding, and sometimes expressive language or spoken language can be relatively better than an individual's receptive language. And this can kind of mask difficulties in understanding, that it's not always apparent to an interviewer that they are struggling to understand and communicate in that way. We've also got social cognition. So in a police interview situation, the witness needs to be thinking about what the interviewer knows already, what they want to know, how much should they tell, when to stop, what level of detail to go into, and so forth. All of this can be difficult for an autistic person. Autistic people also can have difficulties with executive functions. So this is trying to hold lots of information in mind and manipulate it kind of online, if you like. So this might be remembering all parts of a really long-winded question, or trying to figure out what the interviewer wants to know while simultaneously trying to remember a memory oneself, and sort of juggling that and trying to make these kind of decisions about what to report and in what level of detail. Episodic memory. So this is memory for specific past personally experienced events, which is obviously what's going to be recalled in a police interview normally. And we see very specific memory difficulties in autism that relate to episodic memory. And I'll talk a bit more about that next. We also see difficulties in narratives and relational processing. So really recounting an event is to some extent storytelling. Okay, it's a truthful story, but it has to be put in a kind of narrative that makes sense to a listener. So the elements among relations among people and actions is kind of clear for a naive listener. And autistic people can find this quite difficult doing this for a neurotypical listener, at least. Recalling information from memory in a police interview or any point really requires metacognitive monitoring. So we're making a series of unconscious decisions about what to report based on how confident we are in the accuracy of that information. So if we're really sure we know something, we might report information at a very fine-grained level of detail. Whereas if we sort of have a sort of more hazy memory of something, we might report it at a kind of coarser grain if we're like not quite so sure. Again, this is another area of difficulty in autism. And then, of course, the environment and the situation is new. It's probably going to be really stressful, anxiety provoking. There might be lots of kind of sensory issues going on, a kind of noisy, sterile, or sort of might be unusual smells, and all these sorts of issues that might come together in a police station. So all of these things are going to be stressful for anybody, but particularly for an autistic person. And of course, stress then impairs one's ability to recall information from memory. So it's this sort of cycle. So a bit more about memory. So episodes are kind of, or past personally experienced episodes, a co-occurrence of elements of an experience. So for example, thinking about the last time you went out for dinner with a particular friend, that will be marked in your memory as different from other times that you've been out for dinner with that same friend or with other friends. It's sort of the who, the what, the where, the when, what happened, what made that episode distinct from other episodes. And they sort of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And this is important in order to be able to recall episodes and not mix together like different jigsaw puzzles, if you like. You don't mix the pieces of different jigsaw puzzles, but also that you recall the whole picture as well. So they sort of slot together. So that's episodic memory, whereas semantic memory is more memory for kind of timeless information or general information, so facts, things that used to happen. We find in autism, it's the episodic memory, it's the piecing together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and not confusing them with other jigsaw puzzles that autistic people can have difficulty with, whereas their semantic memory or memory for past sort of longer term events is intact or undiminished. So as such, they have difficulty recalling contextual information together in context to recall coherent bound episodes. And also then, of course, monitoring the source of information. So they might know a piece of information, but confuse where or when that happened or where or when they learned it. Importantly, though, autistic people can recall as much as non-autistic people on episodic memory tests if they are appropriately prompted. So the task support hypothesis basically suggests that under unsupported tests, so things like free recall, tell me everything that happened, there's no kind of support for one's recall there. That's when autistic people tend to recall fewer details than non-autistic people. When they're given cued recall tests, or even better, recognition tests, so was there a man there, was he wearing a green hat, autistic people recall as much as non-autistic people using these more kind of cued or recognition type tests, which is really important because it suggests that the episodic memory difficulties we see in autism are a retrieval rather than an encoding issue. So of course, if you don't encode something, you don't process it in the first place, you're not going to be able to remember it. But if you do process it, you just have to struggle to retrieve that memory, then there's maybe techniques that we can use to help that memory retrieval. So of course, this doesn't apply, it's not, you can't go into a police interview and start giving people like recognition and cued recall tests, because that would be suggestive questioning, potentially leading. But it is important to kind of bear this in mind because we can develop other techniques that can help. So how effective are current police witness interviewing methods for an autistic person? So the gold standard police interviewing is to start with free recall and then ask questions based on what the witness has already said. So this is a sort of, tell me everything that happened. Hopefully then the witness will give an account, and then that's followed up with the use of open questions using drawing on things they've already said in their free recall. The aim with this is to encourage witnesses to engage in an exhaustive search in their memory and hopefully induce more elaborate responses. So that's the kind of gold standard. It's widely recognised in psychological research as eliciting better quality retrieval, so accurate details and largely quite a large quantity of information as well. And it's the gold standard now in police interviewing. In autism, however, free recall is problematic, as sort of suggested by the task support hypothesis. So sometimes we find autistic people's recall, when it's sort of just without any prompts, just tell me what happened, can be less complete, particularly for people and actions, which is fairly crucial normally for an investigation. Sometimes it can also be less accurate. So, for example, I mentioned sort of source monitoring. So monitoring who, what, where, when something happened. It can often be less specific. So they're giving fewer particular instances with contextual detail and more kind of general information. And sometimes it can be less relevant in terms of coherence and causality. So that's kind of pulling together a narrative that kind of makes sense to a listener. So we find these problems with free recall. So just jumping back now to police interviewing techniques specifically, the cognitive interview is one of the most widely researched, empirically and theoretically informed police witness interviewing technique. So it's been around now for about 30 years. It's based on several psychological principles, one of them being what we call the encoding specificity principle. So this is where if you recreate the context that you experienced when you witnessed an event, when you come to recall it, so you match that contextual information or that contextual experience, you can recall more information. So this is achieved through a process called context reinstatement. So the interviewer will usually give a series of verbal instructions encouraging the witness to close their eyes and focus and mentally travel back in time to think about all the contextual information, like how they were feeling, what the weather was like, what happened just leading up to the event, and any sort of sensory information that might sort of put them mentally back in that context before they freely recall everything they can remember. The cognitive interview also relies on multiple and varied retrieval. So this is on the basis that memories are stored as a series of interconnected nodes, and you can access a single memory in a number of different ways. And actually, if you try different routes in to access that memory, sometimes you can trigger new details. So in the cognitive interview, this will be done by asking a witness to recall the event again, but this time backwards. So they'll say, you know, the last thing you said happened was you saw two men jump in the car and drive off. What happened just before that? What happened just before that? And they work backwards. Or they can be asked to recall the event again, but imagining that they're looking down on the event from a bird's eye perspective. And these have been found to trigger more detail in neurotypical witnesses. And also social communication techniques is a big part of the cognitive interview as well. So really building up rapport with a witness, making them feel like they have control over the interview. You know, it's a very kind of social communication experience. And so the cognitive interview has been shown to be effective for, as I said, neurotypical witnesses, also modified forms for children, elderly witnesses, witnesses with intellectual disability to some degree as well. So given the task support hypothesis, we might sort of provisionally predict that the cognitive interview would also be useful for autistic witnesses. However, we found that actually for autistic witnesses, it doesn't significantly increase the number of correct details that they recall as it does for non-autistic witnesses. You know, they do better non-autistic witnesses do better in a cognitive interview than what we call a structured interview, which has just got the same number of, you ask them to recall the event the same number of times, but you don't use these cognitive mnemonics like context reinstatement and recalling the event in different order and things. So this is important because the cognitive interview is costly. It's time consuming for officers to conduct. It requires quite a lot of training. And it's, you know, it's effortful for both the witness and the interviewer to conduct it. So it's suggesting, these data is suggesting that the cognitive interview isn't effective in eliciting more details from autistic witnesses. But also, it actually increases error reporting. So autistic witnesses become less accurate when they're given a cognitive interview. So I'm thinking now about some alternative techniques that could be used. So if you can't use a cognitive interview, free recall is not so good. We can use different types of questions. So a study with autistic, I think they're adolescents, kind of broke different question types down into whether they were just invitations. So this is basically kind of free recall. Tell me what happened. There's no restriction on focus. Cued invitations. So this is refocusing attention on something the witness has previously mentioned and then using them as contextual cues. So for example, you mentioned that there were two men exchanging something. Tell me about that. So this is kind of narrowing the parameters. Directive questions. So this is sort of more like when, where did it happen? What color was the puzzle? This sort of thing. And option posing prompts. So closed, yes, no, or forced choice questions, which we know from a whole body of research tend to not be very good. They tend to limit a response, obviously, because it's just, you're just answering yes or no, or in the forced choice. But also they can be very leading as well. So a witness feels like they have to pick one of the two options, even if their memory isn't very clear, or there was a third option, they don't feel like they can say what it was. So this study found that for autistic children, the cued invitations actually elicited the most accurate and detailed information from them. So this is refocusing their attention on something they've previously mentioned and then sort of, you know, using that to ask them to elaborate on it, which makes sense because that's, you know, more of a cued recall. If it's something they've already said, it's non-leading as well, because they've already, you know, already mentioned this. The problem is, of course, you still got to get them to say it in the first place. So you still got to have this free recall portion first. With adults, we did a study testing out different types of different methods of questioning and prompting. We compared, I've kind of simplified the conditions here, but we had very open questions like, tell me about the last time you went to the bank. But we also used more supportive questions, which we termed visual verbal prompting. So this is where the witness is prompted to recall the who, the what, the where, the when, and they're actually given a pie chart in front of them, and they can go around it with a marker to, as they're recalling the last time they went to the bank, they're recalling all of these bits of information about that experience. So it's kind of cued, but in a sort of non-leading way. And we found that this visual verbal prompting improved the specificity. So this is giving more contextual detail, giving more a richer account of what happened in that particular instance, and improve the specificity of actually both autistic and non-autistic interviewees' responses. So that's, you know, getting into the specific when you're actually questioning a witness, that can be quite useful to sort of specify what sort of information you want from them without being leading about it. But of course, questions are not appropriate straight off within a legal framework. You know, you can only ask questions based on what a witness has already said. And if you go straight in with questions, then you're going to have to be asking about something the witness hasn't already said. They limit completeness as well, because their witnesses will typically only provide an answer to the question itself. And there might be other information that they know about, but they're not recalling because they weren't asked about it. And importantly as well, just a sort of a note about suggestibility and compliance, because it's quite often said that autistic people are more suggestible. Actually, the research shows that that's not the case. Autistic people are not more suggestible. And by suggestible, I mean their memories are genuinely likely to be distorted from suggestions that are put to them. That's not the case. At least when we take intellectual disability out of the equation, people with intellectual disability do tend to be more suggestible, regardless of whether they're also autistic or not. But when someone's autistic but not with intellectual disability, they're not more suggestible than non-autistic people. However, they may be more compliant. So this is the tendency to go along with something for compliance reasons, like, you know, they want to get out of the interview earlier, or they feel like they can't disagree with the interviewer, or a desire to please, and these sorts of things. So another reason why questions might be problematic, particularly within a legal setting. So we've looked at, you know, police perspective. So what are they actually doing when they are interviewing autistic witnesses? We've talked to officers, detectives, interviewers who are, we found that they are drawing on a range of different experiences, unfortunately rarely coming through from formal police training. And quite often when officers report some knowledge about autism or feel like they're making good adaptations in their roles, it's quite often coming from some personal experience they have of autism, like a family member, and they're using that to improve how they interact with autistic people in their role. This is an example from a detective constable about interviewing, what he does when he's interviewing autistic individuals. He says, I allow them free recall and structure questioning around that. There is an element of letting them dictate the flow, but tempered with set boundaries that you set them before that topic starts. For example, tell me what you did from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock yesterday. So I think this is a nice kind of example of how, like, narrowing the parameters can be really helpful for autistic people. So just thinking back to some of the issues with interviewing that can be particularly difficult. You know, you've got executive functions, you've got, you know, tell me everything that happened, trying to remember everything that happened, process it, determine what to recall, how accurate you're likely to be about each detail, and then produce a narrative about that is really cognitively demanding. So if you've narrowed the parameters, you've immediately taken out some of that cognitive burden. It also sort of reduces the mind reading that's required in Tell Me Everything. You know, it's quite clear. Tell me what you did from 12 till 3 p.m. yesterday. You know, the parameters again there are, you know, are clearer. There's less mind reading. So we wanted to develop an interviewing model or technique that could be useful for interviewing officers for autistic people, that is compatible within a legally appropriate framework. So that is witness-led from the outset. So it's not introducing interviewer, you know, led cues, whilst at the same time supports the way that autistic people remember and recall events. So we've named this the witness aimed first account, or WAFA technique for short. So rather than in a sort of gold standard or regular police interview, it will generally go, tell me everything that happened, don't leave anything out, and the witness will give a blurb, and then they're questioned about what they've said afterwards. In the WAFA interview, rather than saying tell me everything that happened, don't leave anything out, the witness is asked to basically segment the event up into more manageable brief chunks. So the interviewer might say, explain that this is what's going to happen, so they know that they are going to be segmenting the event up, and that it's brief to start with. Might say, okay, tell me the most important thing that happened. And the interviewee might say, the man snatched a woman's handbag from a car. And the interviewer will write that maybe on a post-it note, stick it on the wall or whatever. And then they'll say, okay, brilliant, tell me something else that happened. And the interviewee might say, okay, a girl came up to the man and asked if he had any change for parking. So the interviewer will write that down, put it on a post-it note, and so forth, until you've got these sort of brief segments of the event that the interviewee can see. They've sort of mapped it out, it's visual. And then they can park that. They then haven't got to kind of keep processing all that information. And then they return to each of the topics in turn and are asked to freely recall each of the post-it notes in as much detail as possible. So, okay, let's go to this first segment. You said the man snatched a woman's handbag from the car. Can you tell me absolutely everything you remember about that? Don't leave anything out. And the witness will then give their sort of account within those parameters, which can then be followed up with questions from the interviewer probing for more information, and then they can move on to the next segment. So the aim with this WAFA technique was to reduce demands on relational retrieval processes, because the witness hasn't then got to keep making these relations amongst different elements of the experience and relaying that to the interviewer. So it's also reducing demands on executive functions and working memory. It's scaffolding a more individual processing style, and it's witness-led, so it's witness-compatible. So it's not like the interviewer is imposing this structure on them to recall an event. They are imposing it themselves. And it should hopefully reduce implicit task demands as well. So it's quite clear what they're being asked to do and where the parameters are, albeit because the interviewee has set these parameters themselves. So we've tested it in the lab, and it improves the number of correct details recalled by both autistic and non-autistic witnesses compared to a control achieving best evidence interview. It also improves accuracy as well for both autistic and non-autistic witnesses. So we're getting more detail, and the detail is more accurate. So that's quite exciting, because I've spent a lot of years talking about research findings in relation to police interviewing and autism, and telling everybody what doesn't work, and then not really be able to come up with anything that does work. So I'm really excited to finally have some techniques that can hopefully be quite useful. And also, I think the thing with those is that they can be useful for non-autistic witnesses too. So it doesn't matter if someone has a diagnosis or not. If it feels appropriate to use that technique, that could be fine. Just some other techniques as well. So there's sketching, which this can be done in different ways. This can either be done in a way whereby the witness is asked to recall the event and sketch it at the same time, and they're kind of recalling what happened, or it can be used as a sort of context reinstatement tool. So the witness is asked to draw anything that reminds them of the event, and then to recall the event. This has been shown to be a useful aid for both children and autistic adults. Obviously, it depends on the event itself whether it would be appropriate or not to do sketching. I think it improves the accuracy, but not so much the quantity of information. So you might get more accurate information, but you might not necessarily get more. But it can be seen as sort of a tool in the interviewer's tool belt that could be used in addition to other techniques, or just on a sort of tailored basis, depending on the interviewee and the nature of the event that they're recalling. Another option, which needs further examination, is to use more remote forms of interviewing to alleviate the social cognitive burden. So this is quite a kind of complicated study, but just just to oversimplify it a bit, it's not all about accuracy or detail. When one's recalling an event, there's a trade-off between the two, as I just sort of mentioned at the beginning, that you recall information, you're making a series of implicit or unconscious decisions about whether to report information based on how confident you are in its accuracy. So we looked at this kind of process across 3 phases of questioning for an eyewitness event in autistic and non-autistic witnesses, and they were either questioned socially in a face-to-face regular interview, or online, and they typed their answers out. So both groups' accuracy improved with the instruction to maximize accuracy over informativeness. So if the interviewer said, or the computer said, right, try to be as accurate as you can rather than detailed, accuracy is the thing we need to strive for. Both autistic and non-autistic witnesses were more accurate. Interestingly, both groups were also more accurate when the questions were delivered socially than when they were delivered online, which is a bit surprising, because there's sort of lots of reasons to think that possibly online questioning might be better for autistic people who may find a social face-to-face interview a little bit too demanding. So that is interesting, because it suggests that social interviewing, for whatever reason, be it motivation or some other reasons, is more interesting or more motivating for witnesses. But what we did see is when we looked at this very subtle measure of reporting control, so this decision making between the trade-off between accuracy and informativeness, we did actually find that autistic people made better decisions. It helped their decision-making process about making this trade-off when interviews were conducted online than when they were conducted socially. So this is just very kind of preliminary findings. We need more research on this, but potentially having a non-social or possibly a quasi-social format, so minimizing the sort of the social demands, might be more fruitful. So just to sort of wrap up with some guidance that's available. So there's I haven't had time to talk about intermediaries, but the witness intermediary scheme is really important. So witnesses can receive special measures, including an registered intermediary who is normally a trained professional, quite often a speech and language therapist, although not always, who can conduct a tailored assessment of that individual witness and then advise the interviewers on how best to conduct this interview, sit in the interviews to facilitate communication between the witness and the interviewer. There's also guidance produced by the National Autistic Society, which contains some details about all aspects of the criminal justice system process for working with autistic people. And we've also produced some guidance on conducting an investigative interview with an autistic person, which is available via that link there. So just other considerations. I've talked specifically about interviewing techniques, but giving witnesses or anybody really that's being interviewed by the police lots of information about what is going to happen before they get there can be really, really useful. So this could be in the form of a letter or an email, often with pictures of where it is they've got to go. That just alleviates some of the stress associated with it. I was just going to say briefly about disclosing diagnosis is obviously key. Autistic people don't always disclose their diagnosis. And we find that that's quite often because they fear being victimized as a result of it. But actually research findings show the contrary, that if you reveal an individual knows that the person is autistic, they actually rate them more positively. They rate them as more credible, and that's regardless of whether they are a witness or a defendant. This is in laboratory-based studies. So I've talked about witness interviews. just a quick note on suspect interviews. There will be some similar principles. We don't have any published research on this yet, although Ralph Bagnall is just completing PhD research on this. So there will be some findings out very soon. So watch this space. But there are additional concerns in a suspect interview, such as the deception elements and the techniques that are designed to maximize cognitive load in order to detect deception can be very difficult for an autistic person, of course. So key points, we need to take a flexible interviewing approach. One size does not fit all. Rethinking traditional cognitive interviewing models, thinking about alternative techniques, making environmental adjustments. So, for example, reducing the sensory issues around the environment, interviewing in a different place, if appropriate. Encouraging diagnosis disclosure in order to make adaptations and not misattribute behaviours to autistic behaviours that might otherwise be seen as something else other than the autism. If you know someone's autistic, you can say, okay, well, I know those behaviours are autistic, and it helps people to it improves perceptions. And requesting support, so a registered intermediary with witnesses or a non-registered intermediary or appropriate adult with suspects. So some resources on this slide here. Thank you very much for listening. My email is there. I'm really sorry I can't present in live today, but please do feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I'm happy to share links to resources and everything as well. Okay, thank you for listening.